Today's lesson is 1.4 Quadratic Equations. Really key word for this section title, quadratic. This was something that we learned in the very first chapter at the beginning of the year is what that word meant. And it had to do with the degree of the equation. And so if you look to all these examples down here, the degree of every single one of these equations is 2. This one needs a little bit of work, which we'll talk about in a second. But notice we have x squared here, x squared, x squared. The degree here is 2, and those are all referred to as quadratic equations. And the word quadratic you may have heard of before, and you hopefully have seen this equation before, and yes, you need to have this memorized, the quadratic formula, and that is how we're going to solve some of these equations, okay? So go ahead, copy down some of these definitions here really quick. Quadratic equation, any degree 2 equation, because the degree is 2, that's what makes it a quadratic, in the form of, here's what standard form looks like, all the numbers in decreasing order, A, B, and C on the right, and 0 on the left. And I also have some steps here in order to solve using the quadratic formula. And given that information, pause the video if you need to and fill in all that stuff. But what we're going to do first is zoom right in on this first example, and we're going to go right into quadratic formula, which this should be a review topic, but you do need to have that formula memorized. And sometimes with the radicals, it gets a little bit tricky. So you don't have to write this out each time, but this means that my A value is 1, my B value is -4, and my C value is -3. And what I'm going to do there is plug in all of those numbers into this quadratic formula over here, the A and the B and the C. And I'll show you a couple tricks on how to do that and how to make it kind of easy, because sometimes squaring numbers and doing quadratic formula, it does get a little bit messy. So what I have using the formula, x equals -b, which means opposite of b, and since b is -4, I'm going to write +4 plus or minus the square root of, and I like to square b in my head because sometimes your calculators will mess it up if you type -4 squared versus -4 in parentheses squared. So you know what -4 squared is. It's always a positive number and it's always going to be 16, so I like to do that in my head and then write the rest of it. So b squared minus 4 times a times c. This is exactly how I write all the quadratic equation problems, all over 2 times a. And make sure that you have your division bar under the 4 as well, so it's all over 2 times a if you've learned the song before. And so there, what you're typing into your calculator, and I'm actually going to write this down, this is exactly what you type into the calculator, 16 minus 4 parentheses 1 parentheses -3. So that's what you're typing. And when you do that in your calculator, you should probably verify this with me because some of you will struggle typing that into your calculator. And I just want to know what that number is. 16 minus 4 parentheses 1 parentheses -3. Type exactly like that. Type like this. Use the parentheses in the calculator. Just like that. And that should give you 28 under there. And then yes, I will break down that radical, but I wanted to know just what that number was first. So from there, you know how to break down radicals. If you want to kind of do a sideways tree like I like to do in class, that 28 is 4 and 7. 4 breaks into 2 and 2, so that simplifies into 4 plus or minus 2 radical 7 over 2. And then remember the heart method. You can reduce those numbers as long as you reduce all 3 of them. And that means our final answer is going to be 4 divides by 2 and gives you 2. 2 divides by 2 and gives you 1 radical 7 over 1. So no fraction needed. So there's our answer for that first one. Okay, so just being really careful in the calculator to do this number right here. What I like to do is square that b first and then write -4 times 1 times -3 and actually type that in the calculator, which gives you 28. Don't type square root of 28. You're going to actually have to break that down yourself because your calculator will give you a decimal. Okay, let's try this second one. Something to notice about this one is that it's not equal to 0, and in standard form needs to equal 0 first. So that means that we're going to have to take this 5 and move it over to the other side. Okay, so that's something that's really important. Whenever you're doing quadratic formula, you need to set the equation equal to 0, which means you might need to do a little bit of work first. 3x squared minus 2x minus 5 equals 0, and now that means that my a is 3, my b is -2, and my c is -5, and I'm good to go for quadratic formula. So again, opposite of b means +2, And then remember, I like to square the negative 2 first. That gives me b squared, which is 4, minus 4 parentheses 3 parentheses negative 5. And that's exactly how I'll type it into my calculator, all over 2 times a. So I'm going to do 2 plus or minus the square root of, when I type in my calculator 4 minus 4 parentheses 3 parentheses negative 5, you get 64 in that radical. So don't square root it yet, just actually write that number in there, because otherwise if you do too much in your head, it's going to get a little bit too confusing. And yes, you know that 64 breaks into 8 and 8, so our answer is 2 plus or minus 8 radical 6, or plus or minus 8 over 6, excuse me. And please don't leave your answer like this. Actually simplify. We can actually like combine like terms and add and subtract and all that kind of stuff. So we're not actually finished yet. Because there was no radical in this answer, we can actually give 2 complete answers. So one of them is going to be 2 plus 8 over 6, and one of them is 2 minus 8 over 6, and I can actually simplify both of those. So if possible, you're supposed to give me 2 complete answers. So 2 plus 8 is 10 over 6, and yeah, that reduces to 5 over 3. That's my first answer. 2 minus 8 is negative 6 over 6. Yes, that reduces to negative 1. That's my second answer. So just note the difference between that problem and the one that we just did. So this one had a radical in it, so we couldn't combine like terms, so we just left it as 2 plus or minus radical 7. This one, all the radicals canceled away, and we could actually give whole number answers. So just notice the difference and make sure that you simplify all of your answers completely. Okay, this next one has a bunch of fractions in it, and you guys know that I hate fractions, so I'm going to try and clear the fractions first. And yes, I'm going to multiply every single thing by 4. So this, and the 0. So make sure that you multiply every single part through by 4, because that's the LCD, and that's going to cancel all of my fractions. That's going to give me 2x squared minus 8x plus 3, still equaling 0 on the right. So now what I can do is my quadratic formula. So hopefully after writing it over and over again, you already have it memorized if you didn't before. So I have x equals the opposite of b, which is going to be positive 8, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 64, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So this is the work that I'm showing, and this is the work that I want you to show while you're doing these problems. 8 plus or minus the square root of, when I do 64 minus 4 parentheses 2 parentheses 3, exactly the way you see it in your calculator, you get a 40 in there. Don't square root the 40, it'll give you a decimal. I just want to know what whole number goes in here. And when I typed that number without the square root, I got 40. And then I still have a 4 in the denominator. And 40 breaks down. It's 4 and 10, which is 2 and 2, and 10 is 2 and 5. So that's going to give me 8 plus or minus 2 radical 10 over 4. Which then you can divide all 3 of those numbers by 2, so we're going to reduce using the heart method. All 3 of those numbers divide by 2, so that gives me 4 plus or minus 1 radical 10 over 2. So there's my completely simplified answer. And this very last one for quadratic formula, what we're going to do here is, again, we have an LCD that we can multiply by. Because right now you don't want to do any of those fractions, so we're going to clear fractions. That's going to give me 3x squared plus 4x, oops, not plus, it's a minus, my bad. And then when I multiply x squared by 10 over x squared, that just gives me positive 10, and x squared times 0 is still 0. So that actually cleaned up all my fractions all at once. Isn't that a cool trick? So now I'm doing x equals opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of. Negative 4 squared is 16 minus 4 times 3 times 10, all over 2 times 3. So in my calculator, I'm going to do that one. And again, I have 4 plus or minus, I'm typing in my calculator 16 minus 4 times 3 times 10. And that number is negative 104 over 6. And we haven't done a negative number yet, but you know that just means that the I can come out front. And then you can simplify the 104, I think. 104 breaks into 4 and 26. That's 2 and 2, and 26 is 2 and 13. So I do have a group of 2 within there. 4 plus or minus 2i. And the numbers that stayed in were 2 and 13, so 26 is still hanging out in there. And then again, I can reduce every single one of those numbers, this one, and this one, all divide by 2. So then I'm going to do 2 plus or minus 1i radical 26 all over 3. So there's my final answer for that one. So really basic quadratic formula stuff. Hopefully that looks familiar to you. But if you have any questions on simplifying, please make sure that you're actually typing those numbers into the calculator so that you know where I'm getting that number from. Okay, this discriminant stuff, maybe it's a vocab word that you've heard before, maybe it's not. I want to do those in class tomorrow so we can kind of talk through them. So I'm going to skip those 3 examples. And I want to go right to the zero product property because these are a little bit easier problems. So the zero product property means that if you have 2 factors that are equaling to 0 when you multiply them together, that means that either the first factor equals 0 or the second factor equals 0. So that is when it factors easily. So some problems that we've done don't factor, like any of these up here. Those are all quadratic formula problems, and so that's one way to solve. And another way to solve, which is easier, especially if you're pretty good at factoring, is to try and factor the problem. Because look at how easy this is when you actually factor the problem. So this one is already factored for us, which is awesome. So all I'm going to do is take my 2 different factors, 2x plus 5, equal it to 0 and solve, or x minus 3 equals 0 and solve that. So when I move the 5 over here, I get 2x equals negative 5 over 2. That's one answer. When I add 3 to both sides here, I get x equals 3. That's my second answer. So when you can factor these, you guys, they're supposed to be super easy, so that's good. And that's another reason why we practiced factoring for a really long time. Make sure that your equation is equal to 0 before you try and factor it, though, just like quadratic formula problems. So we need to move this around just a little bit. And notice how you can divide both sides by 2. So if I divide this side by 2 and this side by 2, I get x squared minus 5x minus 14. And I still have 0 on this side. So that's a trick. If you notice that there's a GCF, then please do divide that out if possible, because that might make it a little easier to factor. So my 2 answers here are positive 7 and negative 2 once you equal them to 0 and solve. Okay, so beware the GCF in that one, and always make sure that you set your equation equal to 0 before you start. This one is set equal to 0, so we're just going to factor it really quickly. However you learned how to factor is fine, but I do the guess and check method. So I know that the only factors of 3x squared are 3x and x, and luckily the only factors of 2 are 2 and 1. So what if I put 1 here and 2 here, and then I'm just foiling in my head. Since it's a negative 2, one of those needs to be negative. And so if I make the 2 negative and the 1 positive, then checking my foiling, 3x squared, that'll give me negative 6 plus 1, which is negative 5. And then 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. So I got it on the first try with guess and check. And then when I equal both of these to 0, I get 3x plus 1 equals 0 and solve, and I get x minus 2 equals 0 and solve that. One answer is 2. Another answer is negative 1 over 3. Okay, so factoring first, and this is actually one of the easiest methods to solve quadratics, but unfortunately a lot of times it doesn't factor completely. In that case, you use quadratic formula. All right, here's our last one. So hopefully you're recognizing this one as a SOAP problem, if you remember that formula. So I need to uncube these numbers. And so that gives me a little parenthesis and a big one, and the signs are the same sign, the opposite sign, and the last sign is always positive. Plug in your x and your 2, and then square the x, square the 2, and then multiply the 2 numbers together in the middle of the 2x. And so at least I factored it, which is good, and this is going to give me an answer of x equals 2, which is awesome. But then, do you remember how to do this part? Because remember, this part doesn't factor. And it never will after using the SOAP formula. So does that mean no solution? Does that mean there's only one answer of 2? No, my friends, this means use quadratic formula. Okay, so we still know how to solve stuff even if it doesn't factor. And this is kind of like the trick or the last hardest question that I need you to do for tonight. But you set your first your first factor equal to 0, and that's an easy answer of 2. This you can't factor, but what did we do before we did these factoring problems? We did quadratic formula. Okay, so you can still do that for this part. And it's going to be irrational solutions or imaginary, one of those two. So just for this part, what I'm going to do is x equals negative b, so negative 2, plus or minus. When I square the 2, I get 4 minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So I'm just going to kind of go through, and I'm not forgetting this answer that I have out here. I'm going to end up with 3 answers here. So when I do 4 minus 4 times 1 times 4, that gives me negative 12 when you do that in your calculator. And so this is just quadratic formula stuff that I'm doing. When I simplify the 12, the I comes out first, and then 12 breaks into 4 and 3. Okay, so that 2 is going to come out along with the I. So I have negative 2 plus or minus 2I radical 3 over 2, and all 3 of those numbers can divide by 2. So I'm going to do that using the Hart method. That gives me negative 1 plus or minus I radical 3 over 1. So let me zoom out just a little bit because we actually have 3 answers for this one. And so one thing that's kind of cool about these problems is that if you notice that we started with a degree 3 in this problem, and all the other ones have been a degree 2, so I'm going to write degree 3. Did you know that that means you should have 3 answers? All the other ones we have 2 answers. When it's a degree 3, here's my first answer, 2. Here are my second 2 answers because of the plus or the minus. So those are my 3 different answers. So just maybe put a little like star next to this one, just because it took us a little bit longer to get through that one. You factor it first, and some of us maybe needed to remember how to factor those SOAP problems. But then we have 1 easy answer and then 2 other harder answers which come from quadratic formula. And the reason we use quadratic formula is because this part does not factor after the SOAP formula. So we actually have 3 answers for this one because we have a degree 3 problem. Okay, so that is all for today. Thank you for watching. Bring your questions to class tomorrow, and then we'll talk about discriminant as well tomorrow, okay? Guys, have a good night.